Everyone talks about how to build a Star Destroyer. The shipyards, the raw materials, the staggering economics of construction. But what about the economics inside one? What do 37,000 people actually do on a ship that might not see combat for months? That question came from one of you, and it stopped me cold. Because here's the thing. We've all seen Star Destroyers looming over planets, chasing the Millennium Falcon, looking menacing as hell. What we haven't seen is what happens inside those corridors when there's nothing to chase. When you're 3 months into a hyperspace patrol, and the most exciting thing that's happened is someone clogged the refresher on Deck 17. A Star Destroyer isn't really a warship, it's a floating city-state. And the Empire had to solve infrastructure problems we still struggle with on Earth. Some solutions elegant, some genuinely horrifying. Let's start with the numbers. The standard complement of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer breaks down to roughly 9,235 officers, 27,850 enlisted personnel, and 9,700 stormtroopers. That's 46,785 human beings living inside 1,600 meters of durasteel. But here's where it gets interesting. The minimum crew required to actually operate the ship? About 2,000 people. 2,000. The Rebel Alliance proved this when they captured Imperial Star Destroyers and ran them with skeleton crews of 7,000 to 8,000 personnel through heavy automation, longer shifts, and reduced stormtrooper contingents. Which means the Empire wasn't overstaffing by accident. They deliberately packed 37,000 plus people onto these ships because it allowed for shorter, more sustainable shift rotations. Think about that for a second. The Empire looked at a vessel that could technically function with 2,000 crew and decided to multiply that number by 18. Not for combat effectiveness, for scheduling logistics. That's a civilization thinking in terms of long-term deployment sustainability, not quick naval engagements. And sustainability becomes everything when you're talking about years, because that's how long these deployments could last. An Imperial-class Star Destroyer carries approximately 2 years' worth of consumables. 2 years of food, water, medical supplies, everything a small city needs to survive completely disconnected from any supply chain. These ships were designed to operate as fully autonomous entities, capable of projecting Imperial power across the galaxy without constant resupply. Now let's talk about what 37,000 people actually do during those 2 years. The Spatial organization tells the story of Imperial hierarchy more clearly than any propaganda holofilm. Officer quarters sit in the command tower, directly below the bridge, a few rooms away from their duty stations. This isn't unique to the Empire. Modern naval vessels do the same thing. When an emergency happens at 0300 hours, you want your commanding officer close enough to reach the bridge in his underwear if necessary. Mid-ranking officers who managed gunnery stations, hangar operations, and departmental functions were quartered on the second level of the superstructure. This same level contained the armory, crew messes, detention facilities, and recreational spaces. Everything an officer might need, consolidated in one section. The 27,000 enlisted personnel? Different story entirely. They're bunked in the midsection of the ship, in 2 large bays positioned on either side of the main propulsion systems. Outboard of the primary hull, outside the superstructure entirely. The message is architectural. Officers belong in the tower. Enlisted personnel work the machinery and sleep near it. And then there's the stormtroopers. 5.5 levels of the vessel are devoted exclusively to trooper housing. The environmental conditions are described in terms that should make anyone uncomfortable. Sweat-stained, stale air hanging between bunks. Minimal ventilation. Extremely high personnel density. These aren't sleeping quarters designed for human beings to thrive. They're storage containers for bodies that need to remain combat ready. The question of whether everyone actually gets their own bunk remains unresolved in canonical sources. But here's what we know from real-world military operations. Hot racking has been standard naval practice since at least the 16th century. The term comes from military slang. Rack meaning bed, Hot because the mattress is still warm from the previous occupant's body heat when the next person lies down. On submarines, where space maximization is critical, 2 or 3 personnel are assigned to the same bunk on rotating schedules. The lowest-ranking crew members always get hot-racking duty. Do the math on 27,000 enlisted personnel crammed into midsection bays, 9,700 stormtroopers across 5.5 levels, and a ship that needs to sustain 2-year deployments. Hot-racking isn't just plausible, it's almost mathematically necessary. Though no source explicitly confirms this, the berthing arithmetic demands it. So what does the daily schedule look like? Junior officers start their day at 0500 hours with mandatory physical training. Only junior officers. The privilege of rank includes sleeping through morning PT. First formation happens between 600 and 700, where junior officers receive inspection from senior personnel and potentially encounter leadership conducting professional development sessions. After formation comes the morning staff huddle. Junior officers receive their tasking assignments. Then they report to their designated workstations. Plans section, operations division, engineering, gunnery, flight operations, logistics, where they spend substantial portions of their day on what one source describes as writing most of the stuff myself. Operational plans, administrative tasks, interdepartmental coordination. The glamour of the Imperial Navy. The workday ends between 1800 and 2000 hours. Then the watch rotation kicks in. Star Destroyers operate on a 3-watch system. The captain takes one 8-hour command shift, the executive officer takes another, and the second officer, who also manages ship security, takes the third. These rotations are staggered with minimal overlap. It was considered noteworthy when a captain appeared during the second officer's watch. This command structure cascades downward. Roughly 1/3 of operational crew maintains active duty at any given moment. The remaining 2/3 cycle through secondary duties, maintenance, training, and rest periods. But here's where the Empire's ideological commitments created massive inefficiency. After the Clone Wars, Imperial military doctrine developed a cultural backlash against dependence on droid systems. The Empire rejected automation. Every position aboard an Imperial Star Destroyer required human crew. No shortcuts. This ideological commitment explains why Star Destroyers carried such enormous complements when the rebellion demonstrated the vessels could function with 1/5 the standard personnel through automation. The Empire chose inefficiency to prove a point about organic human supremacy. The cognitive dissonance between this anti-droid stance and the practical realities of operating a vessel this complex must have created interesting tensions in Imperial doctrine. Now, let's talk about feeding these people. The average human consumes approximately 5 pounds of food per day. Multiply that by 37,000 crew, and you get 250,000 pounds of food consumed daily, every single day, for 2 years. Run those numbers forward. 250,000 pounds times 730 days equals approximately 91,250 tons of food storage required for a full 2-year deployment. Here's the problem. The documented cargo capacity of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer? 40,000 tons. The food requirement alone exceeds total cargo capacity by more than double. Something doesn't add up. Either food storage exists separately from general cargo allocation, treated as a distinct logistics category, or Star Wars universe food technology somehow solves for reduced weight through means never documented. The math simply cannot work otherwise. What we do know is that Imperial military cuisine prioritized shelf life over palatability. The majority of food comes as protein squares and nutrition paste, specifically engineered to remain edible across 2-year storage periods. Nobody's enjoying their meals on a Star Destroyer. They're surviving them. But food isn't even the worst logistics nightmare. Water is. Here's where the canonical sources go frustratingly silent. No documentation exists for water storage capacity or recycling methodology aboard Star Destroyers. But we can reason backward from what we know. 37,000 people need water, not just for drinking, for hygiene, cooking, cleaning, medical uses. Over a 2-year deployment, the water requirement would be staggering, far more than any reasonable cargo allocation could accommodate. The most logical explanation would be near-perfect water recycling. If so, a Star Destroyer would need recycling systems of extraordinary efficiency. Every drop of water on that ship cycles through purification systems repeatedly over a 2-year deployment. The shower water you used this morning was processed waste from last week. The ice in the officer's mess came from condensation scraped off the enlisted quarters walls months ago. The Empire likely solved the water problem. They just solved it in a way that required everyone aboard to ignore what they were actually drinking. And speaking of things nobody wants to think about, where does the waste go? 37,000 people produce waste. A lot of it. The canonical sources don't address waste management systems, but the logistics are inescapable. Over a 2-year deployment, the tonnage would be substantial. Logic suggests a Star Destroyer can't just dump waste into space. Debris trails would seem tactically unwise. Any competent enemy could potentially track the ship by following the garbage. Plus, in the vacuum of space, frozen waste doesn't decompose. It just floats there forever. If the Empire applied its usual authoritarian efficiency to this problem, they weren't leaving their fingerprints scattered across hyperspace lanes. So processing facilities aboard would likely need to be massive. The logical requirements suggest incinerators, recycling systems, compactors, storage compartments for whatever can't be broken down, though no canonical source documents these systems. Somewhere in the belly of every Star Destroyer, entire crews likely spend their shifts managing the biological output of a small city. Nobody joins the Imperial Navy dreaming of waste management duty. But somebody has to do it. The resupply process for everything else reveals just how massive these logistics operations become when a ship does return to port. Zeta-class heavy cargo shuttles measure approximately 35 meters in length and carry 50 to 75 pallets per trip. Assuming 1 ton of food per pallet, the daily food requirement of 250,000 pounds translates to 125 pallets, meaning each shuttle needs 2 trips to deliver 1 day's worth of food. Each loading and unloading cycle takes about 25 minutes. 2 full cycles per day's worth of food means approximately 1 hour per shuttle per day of supplies. The hangars can accommodate 6 to 10 cargo shuttles operating simultaneously. With 10 concurrent shuttles, you can load 10 days worth of food per hour. Extrapolate that to a full 2-year supply, and you're looking at approximately 73 hours of continuous loading operations. 3 days, just for food. That's not including ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, uniform replacements, or any of the 1,000 other things a city of 37,000 people needs to function. Provisioning a Star Destroyer is a military operation unto itself. Speaking of medical supplies, what happens when disease hits? Multiple medical substations exist distributed throughout the ship, but the sources provide no operational details. So let's extrapolate from what we know about confined populations. Consider the practice of hot racking. You're sleeping in a bed still warm from someone else's body. Their sweat is on the pillow. Their breath particles are on the mattress. The conditions for spreading illness are obvious. Now consider the stormtrooper barracks. Sweat-stained, stale air, minimal ventilation, extremely high personnel density. This is an epidemiologist's nightmare. 1 respiratory infection could tear through those compartments in days. But the Empire's structural indifference to morale suggests similar indifference to individual health. The question wasn't whether a trooper got sick. It was whether enough troopers stayed healthy to maintain operational capacity. You don't need everyone. You need enough. At 9,700 stormtroopers, you can afford to lose a significant percentage to illness and still field an intimidating ground force. The math doesn't care about the individuals, only the totals. But what about when the food is loaded, the water recycled, the waste processed, and the ship jumps to hyperspace for extended patrol duty? This is where the canonical evidence gets thin, and I want to be upfront about that. The lore on internal Star Destroyer operations is surprisingly sparse. The sources provide no data on hyperspace travel duration or typical deployment lengths, though we know the ships carry 2 years' worth of consumables. The movies show these ships as weapons. The technical manuals describe armament specifications. Nobody seemed particularly interested in documenting what happens when 37,000 people get bored. What we know. Recreation areas exist on the second level. Multiple mess halls and galley facilities are distributed throughout the ship rather than centralized, because serving 37,000 people from a single facility would create impossible bottlenecks. That's pretty much it. The blueprints don't mention crew quarters, mess halls, or restrooms. These systems clearly exist. They're just considered unworthy of documentation. Do Star Destroyers have cantinas? Shops? Exercise facilities beyond vague recreation references? Does Imperial currency function aboard ship, or is everything rationed by command economy? We don't know. The evidence simply doesn't exist in available sources. What we can reasonably infer: confined military environments tend to develop underground economies, smuggling, gambling, informal barter systems. The question becomes how the Empire dealt with such inevitable human tendencies. The answer appears to be graduated tolerance. Imperial enforcement categorized contraband violations by severity class. Class 5 infractions typically resulted in modest fines, and sources indicate that many Imperial officials would overlook Class 5 offenses entirely in exchange for a bribe. Class 2 infractions, covering weapons smuggling and piracy, triggered severe responses. This graduated enforcement approach created an informal tolerance hierarchy where certain contraband categories received tacit acceptance while others triggered severe responses. Historical parallel here, and this one deserves more than a passing mention. English smuggling operations during the Napoleonic Wars demonstrate that even under blockade conditions and wartime discipline, illicit trade networks persisted. Military discipline, war conditions, death penalty for treason. Every reason to comply with official restrictions. Instead, a city of smugglers emerged at Gravelines between 1811 and 1814. French police and administrative records document an entire economy built on moving contraband across the Channel. The English town of Deal appears repeatedly in police reports on prisoners and British smuggling vessels. Even prisoners of war, people locked in military custody, participated in contraband networks. Now picture a Star Destroyer loading dock during third watch. A technician trades a bottle of Corellian brandy for a pack of cigarettes that shouldn't exist aboard ship. A stormtrooper pays for sabacc chips with something he smuggled from the last planet-side deployment. An officer looks the other way because he placed a bet himself last week. The architecture of illicit commerce doesn't change, only the setting. If war zones and prison camps couldn't eliminate black markets, a Star Destroyer patrolling the Outer Rim certainly couldn't either. The Empire's graduated enforcement approach suggests they understood this reality and chose to manage it rather than fight it. Customs agents wouldn't accept bribes for massive explosives, but stolen sublight drives? They might be amenable. The real horror isn't what the Empire prohibited, it's what they institutionalized. Imperial training pipeline lacked morale as a core component, not as an oversight, as a deliberate structural absence. The rebellion possessed morale-building mechanisms that the Empire simply didn't develop. This wasn't situational, it was policy. Consider the TIE pilot program. Imperial TIE fighters were described as bare bones. No hyperdrive, no shields, no heavy weapons, no life support systems. Pilots were completely dependent on their carrier ships for everything. They couldn't survive independently beyond their immediate combat radius. They couldn't retreat. They couldn't escape. This created psychological conditions of total technological imprisonment. A TIE pilot wasn't just stationed on a Star Destroyer. They were trapped there. Their fighter could not sustain their life without immediate return to the mothership. Every mission was a one-way trip until proven otherwise. The result? A continuous influx of Imperial defectors to the rebellion that ultimately sustained Rebel Starfighter Corps growth. People broke. People ran. The Empire acknowledged the problem. High Command reviewed casualty reports, but building replacement ships was very expensive. Rather than invest in pilot retention, resources were diverted toward Death Star projects and fleets of Super Star Destroyers instead. That's the horrifying part. Not cruelty for its own sake. Calculated indifference. The Empire ran the numbers on human psychological welfare, decided the cost of caring exceeded the cost of replacement, and built systems accordingly. Think about what extended deployment means. The sources don't give us specific patrol durations, but we know these ships carry 2 years' worth of consumables for a reason. No documented mental health support, no morale programs, protein paste and recycled water, sleeping in shifts on someone else's still warm mattress, watching your fellow crew members gradually hollow out. The Empire didn't solve the psychology of long deployments. They just built ships large enough that individual psychological casualties didn't threaten operational capacity. You can lose a lot of people to despair when you've got 37,000 spares. And that brings us back to the thesis. A Star Destroyer is less a warship and more a mobile city-state. It has neighborhoods, officer country in the tower, enlisted barracks in the midsection, stormtrooper storage in the lower levels. It has infrastructure problems, food logistics, water recycling, waste management, traffic flow through 1,600 meters of corridors. It has social stratification, private cabins for officers, communal bunking for enlisted, ventilation-poor warehousing for troopers. It has underground economies operating in the gaps between official policy and human nature. The Empire solved these problems, sort of. They figured out how to keep 37,000 people alive for 2 years in a metal box. They designed food storage systems, developed shift rotations that prevented burnout, built multiple mess halls to distribute feeding times across the day cycle, installed water recycling systems that kept everyone hydrated. But they solved these problems, like the Empire solves everything, with industrial scale and institutional indifference. Humans as logistics, morale as externality, psychological welfare as acceptable loss. The next time you see a Star Destroyer on screen, don't think about the turbo lasers. Think about the 37,000 people inside. Think about the junior officer who started PT at 0500 this morning and won't finish work until 2000 tonight. Think about the enlisted crewman sleeping in a bed still warm from the last occupant. Think about the stormtrooper breathing sweat-stained air in a compartment with minimal ventilation, drinking water that was someone else's waste 2 weeks ago. Think about the TIE pilot who knows their fighter can't sustain life beyond immediate combat radius, climbing into the cockpit for another mission anyway. Think about the technician in waste management who signed up to serve the Empire and spends their days processing sewage. Think about the black market dealer on Deck 23 who makes more friends than enemies because everyone needs something the official channels don't provide. The Empire built floating cities. The people inside those cities paid the rent in ways the movies never showed. Subscribe for more stories like this.